session.
Coming to this final session of the Humanities Center Conference. My name is Ruth Ray. I'm a member of the advisory board of the Humanities Center, and I'm glad to welcome you here and our panelists this afternoon, who I am going to keep to a very rigid time schedule. I will be putting up the 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left signs to keep you on track. The plan is for Dr. Bove, our guest speaker, to speak for about 45 minutes and then address questions in the last 15 minutes of his talk. The other three speakers will talk for about 20 minutes and address questions in the last 5 minutes of their talk. Dr. Bove is Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh and also serves as editor of the International Journal of Literature and Culture called Boundary 2, which is published by Duke University Press. He also holds affiliations with the Institute for Cultural Studies at the University of Valencia in Spain and the Center for International Political Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. From 1994 to 1999, he served on the board of directors of the Institute of Postmodern Studies at Peking University. Besides offering over 100 refereed articles, Dr. Bove has written many books, including Mastering Discourse, The Politics of Intellectual Culture, Intellectuals in Power, A Genealogy of Critical Humanism, Destructive Poetics, Heidegger and Modern American Poetry, and Poetry Against Torture. In his most recent work, which you will be hearing about today, he is examining the life and work of Henry Adams. His talk comes from his current book project, Henry Adams and the creative love of imagination. Dr. Bove.
Thank you very much, Professor Ray, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm doing the obligatory thing, which is to say I'm shutting off my own self. I have so many thanks to give that I won't want to use up all my time doing it, but I have to say some thanks, of course. I have to thank Walter Edwards for all of this, of course, and particularly for the grace of his allowing me not only to be here today, but accommodating some ambition to have me here yesterday as well. And for that, I need to give special thanks to my longtime good friend and close number 2 editorial colleague, Catherine Lindbergh, who really is the figure whose interest and presence here has made it easy, possible, and really quite happy for me to come along. I should say at some point, I won't say it now, but I'll just tell you that at some point I'll say that Catherine and I have known each other for so long and so well that occasionally I tease her with my coworker sis, but I won't say that. I've actually also changed the title of this talk. I had hoped to get the new title into the production process. I think I was a little late. I decided to be somewhat more polemical rather than to be as creatively scholarly as one would like to be around Henry Adams. So the function and title of this rather polemical piece is gracefully without a subtitle. The title is Why the Neocons Hate Henry Adams. And before I begin that, I have to give a very special thanks, particularly to Professor Weisberg for her talk earlier today, which was not just as one would expect, extraordinarily brilliantly lucid in its very historical consequences, but made it so much easier for me to say what I need to say here, which is the problem of Bildung, which is so hard to render in English. I will just loosely play with Adams's term education and say something about that as we go along, but to remind us of the politics of Bildung and the often undesirable nature of that politics, particularly before we rush to embrace it as a concept within U.S. university practice and humanities education in particular. So this piece, which is polemical and therefore political, benefits enormously Professor Weisberg's reminded all of us earlier. So I'm going to proceed with nothing like, I'm afraid, her solitude. In the new criterion in 1983, Norman Podhoretz, immediately see the latter. So, 1983, Norman Podhoretz wrote, quote, "I see little of value that would be lost by allowing Henry Adams to slip into the obscurity he so often boasted of wishing to achieve." In his book entitled The Bloody Crossroads, Where Literature and Politics Meet, Podhoretz wrote at great length to link Henry Adams to the then fashionable target of right-wing intellectuals, the so-called new class. The adversarial elite, that's his phrase, that stood in disdainful opposition to the current state of American politics and culture. Writing in the tradition of Topic Parsons' critique of intellectual leadership in creating the welfare state, Podhoretz objected to Adams and his supposed heirs in the new class for wanting to substitute the leadership of educated elites for the messy politics of democratic contention. Essentially, for Podhoretz, Adams was a bad American, a traitor to its democracy, and a forerunner of the leftist sympathizers, the experts from government and academia, who would dominate public policy, culture, and state institutions. The Bloody Crossroads insidiously implies a connection between Adams and the new class on the one hand, and the communist sympathizers who supported the Soviet Union not only during the Cold War, but also after the 1917 Russian Revolution. The neocons, I'm afraid, have very long memories. Reviewing Podhoretz in the New York Times, Cynthia Ozick quickly saw how Adams stood in for all the political and cultural traits that Podhoretz and his colleagues despised. This is Ozick. The elitist bitterness of Adams with his half-concealed hunger for domination, his disappointed superiority, and his fastidious contempt for bourgeois satisfactions is here almost allegorical. That is, in Podhoretz, almost allegorical. No doubt we're being told something about the potential for political irrelevance of intellectuals who substitute the Adams style of mechanical, melodramatic, national self-disgust for ordinary, often imperfect democratic repair. Now, Ozick's prose suffers a surprising weakness here. We cannot quite tell how near or far she stands to Podhoretz's frightening display of readerly incompetence in producing this image of Adams. No matter, however, for Podhoretz invoking Edmund Wilson and John J. Chapman announces his dislike of the education and refuses to follow Wilson in taking Adams as an indictment, that's Wilson's term, Adams as an indictment of the capitalist debacle America had become after the Civil War and through the Gilded Age. We would be wrong to accuse Podhoretz of blind loyalty to market capitalism, although he certainly suffered from that belief. What matters in this case is Adams' assumption of an intellectual stance against what America had become after the Civil War, a political and social form dominated by corporate interests, dehumanized practices of subject formation, and a war-based economy. As harsh as it might seem, it is Podhoretz and the neocons' warm embrace of war, corporatism, and mystification that makes Adams a necessary adversary and easily available bogeyman for their political visions and tyrannical populist demagoguery. I'm not going to discuss it here, but in his memoir, autobiography, Podhoretz, looking around at America, says, "We now suffer from ennui, a loss of value," and asks the question, what is the source of the valuelessness of contemporary American society, its ennui? And the answer he offers is, it's the irony of Henry Adams' prose style. Admirers and detractors both make much of Podhoretz having studied with Lionel Trilling and F.R. Leavis. Perhaps from Leavis, Podhoretz inherited the belief that prejudice can stand in for criticism. But surely he did not learn from Trilling how to read. The greatest Adams scholar is the poet-critic R.P. Blackmer, whose care for reading is legendary, and whose judgments always rest on sharp evidence and close examination. Typically, Podhoretz sweeps Blackmer aside, precisely because Blackmer's research concludes the opposite of Podhoretz's prejudiced belief. For Podhoretz, as for all sectarians, but for this group of warmongers in particular, care, curiosity, and I'm not using that word warmonger loosely, I'll come back to it. Particular care, curiosity, and creativity may not obstruct the exercise of power for immediate desires. In almost all the issues that matter here, war stands at their center and as their nexus. For the neocons, war is a good. exciting and high-purposed, legitimated by their own sense of American exceptionalism. Their hyper-patriotism, the chauvinism of their public statements, forbids all criticism of American economic forms and their cultural and political consequences, despite their differing judgments of the education of Henry Adams. Blackmer and Wilson both conclude that Adams had a good reading of American life from 1868 through the Gilded Age, and that indeed, as Blackmer put it, the United States in that period was unable, and now I quote Blackmer, the United States was unable to furnish a free field for intelligent political action. But Horace rejects out of hand any such criticism of American life and institutions. He follows the same line as Louis Cronenberger, who in 1939 wrote this, and I quote, "The education is a grand-scale study of maladjustment, of the failure of an exceptional personality to mesh with a prodigious civilization." End quote. When America fails, when it deserves criticism, is only when it allows Adams-esque figures to gain influence, thereby weakening American values, American confidence in its own identity, and American will to act in the world in its own interest, establishing its own rule. Therefore, in contrast to Adams, Horace admires Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, whose imperial ambitions Horace hides in counterpoising them to Adams's mask. They, this is Horace now, they, Roosevelt, Cabot Lodge, were nevertheless able to enter public life and make a great mark on the times. Adams's letters in particular sparkle with brilliant demolitions of Roosevelt and Lodge and record serious suspicions of their abilities among other members of the ruling class, such as the Secretary of State and author of the Open Door Policy, John Hay. Edward Chalfont's extraordinary 3-volume study of Adams's life and work argues convincingly that we should consider Adams the co-Secretary of State during Hay's years in office for his influence on and involvement in U.S. policy. In other words, Chalfont's research shows yet again what careful readers of Adams know, that the quote-unquote Henry Adams, the character against which Horace rants, is a literary creation, a figural device for the agony of thought and intellectual curiosity of a kind that any good reader or a careful thinker would also find in such venerable classics as Thucydides, wherein the stage debates over life, death, war, and extermination create the occasion for thinking, imagining, weighing, and acting. Just as Thucydides had the courage to allow Athens to consider exterminist politics, so Adams had the courage to allow his America to throw up a Ulysses-esque Grant from what he called the chthonic depths, to make us wonder if a society might devolve as the species evolves. What Horace and other neocons lack, of course, is intellectual courage. How easy to stand in the face of no ambiguity and so escape the fate of Coleridge. They always know what to do and never hesitate over a course of action. Traditional American conservatives have embraced Henry Adams as often as the neocons have discarded him. In the conservative mind from Burke to Santayana, of course, the founding text of the post-war conservative movement written at exactly the time that Lionel Trilling was claiming in the liberal imagination there are no conservative ideas in America. In the conservative mind from Burke to Santayana, for example, Russell Kirk, the figure most responsible for the post-war renewal of American conservatism, drew this remarkable sketch of Adams in 1953, and I quote, "Henry Adams is the most irritating person in American letters, and the most provocative writer, and the best historian, and possibly the most penetrating critic of ideas. The best cure for vexation with Henry Adams is to read his detractors, for against his Olympian amusement at a dying world and his real inner modesty, their snarls and quibbles furnish a relief which displays Adams's learning and wit as no amount of adulation could." He continues, "A case might be made that Henry Adams represents the zenith of American civilization, unmistakably and almost belligerently American, the end product of 4 generations of exceptional rectitude and remarkable intelligence, very likely the best educated man American society has ever produced." End of quote. So while Horace and other neocons detest modernity, they locate its most dire effects in an educated elite that they claim substitutes